Hello and welcome to the Virtuous Life. I'm your host, Pat Oedy-Murray. And today we're dealing with a topic that has just been intriguing to me and on my mind. And I started to implement it into my bioethics class that I teach. So I was so excited when I got a request from Sophia Press if I was interested in this book and also interested in interviewing the author. And I said yes to both of those. So today our guest is Grayson Quay. He is a consultant and author, formerly a news and opinion editor at the Daily Caller and the weekend editor at The Week. He's a graduate of Grove City College and Georgetown University, and his writing has appeared at First Things, The Spectator, The Federalist, Modern Age, American Conservative, and many others. And the book that we're going to be talking about today that he has written is called The Transhumanist Temptation. Welcome, Grayson. How you doing today?
Doing great. Thank you for having me.
Well, I must admit, man, this book, it just makes my head explode. There's so much in here. And it was like just trying to keep up with it all. But I must admit, I love the way you laid it out. Just to let the audience know, he's got five, if I'm not mistaken, five major sections. And he talks about transhumanism in each of the five. And it amazed me, Grayson, all the things that are pulled into this concept of transhumanism. And I must admit, I never made all those connections. So before we get rolling, can you kind of define for our audience transhumanism? Because so many things are attached to it.
Yeah, so transhumanism, just etymologically, trans kind of across or beyond, and then human. So it just means going beyond human nature or human limitations, and generally with the use of technology. So this could encompass, kind of in popular discourse, it's usually these cutting edge science fiction type technologies, the designer babies, genetic engineering, cyborg stuff, neural implants, being able to upload your brain to the cloud and live forever in virtual reality, stuff like this.
Right.
And I think that that's how most people view it, as this sort of science fiction thing that, there's some kind of emergent technologies that raise these questions, but mostly it's all in the future. And I wrote this book to try to the threat feel more immediate to people, because I think that if you step back and take a view of transhumanism that isn't necessarily dependent on technology, and view it more as a philosophy or even as a theology, you get a more accurate picture of what it is and also why we seem to be barreling towards it with no ability to apply the brakes.
Yeah, I think that, and I love that one of the first things you start out with is kind of trying to get us to understand that this is kind of a philosophical thing. You lead us through that. And so I want to kind of ask, because humanism, right? Did you see that as kind of the first step toward transhumanism? And you kind of say humanism is kind of a synonym for like atheism, if we talk about them in the same breath.
Yeah, so that's tricky. I went back and forth on this with writing the book of whether I wanted to define myself as kind of a humanist as opposed to a transhumanist. And I ended up going away from that just because the word has just sort of been hijacked, I think. I think there is a very real thing called Christian transhumanism, Christian humanism, the idea of wanting humans to flourish as human beings. But mostly, today people who describe themselves as humanists tend to be using it as shorthand for secular humanists or just atheists. And many of those people are very on board with transhumanism. And that makes sense, because when you reject the idea of God and you reject the idea of natural law, then you don't really believe that there's any duties or obligations that we can infer from the kind of creatures we are, right? Then
Right.
if our biology and our brains and our minds even are just the product of evolutionary forces that operated blindly and produced creatures that were, suited to survive on the savannah 200,000 years ago, but aren't necessarily suited for modern society, then there's no compelling reason why we shouldn't use the technological tools we've developed to seize control of human evolution and direct it ourselves rather than letting it be directed blindly. G.K. Chesterton makes this point in a really excellent passage from one of his books, where he says, I don't have an objection necessarily to a theory of evolution, to the idea that God may have used this process to produce the creatures he wanted to produce. Mm-hmm. But, when he says that, it's like there's an end point, right? That the goal was to produce humanity. But if you adopt evolution as kind of an all-encompassing philosophical framework apart from any understanding of God or any understanding of a goal or a telos to it, which you can have without being explicitly religious. There were a lot of thinkers kind of in the early days of Darwinism who were grappling with the idea of kind of a life force or a creative evolution that was guided in some way that weren't necessarily religious thinkers. But anyway, if you throw all of that out, then all you have is flux. All you have is kind of an endless churn. And trying to, at that point, even humanity becomes a meaningless concept because it's always changing. It's always in flux. It might change too slowly for us to notice in a lifetime, but that's just a function of our perspective. If you sped time up enough, it would be like to give names to peaks and waves in the ocean as if they were mountains. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Exactly.
It's just a linguistic, there is no such thing as humanity or human nature really, except as a linguistic construct. Right. And if everything's just a construct in this sense, then why not, alter it ourselves? Right.
Yeah. And that's always, to me, it always kind of comes down to that. It's, when they say, well, man has been in the process of evolution. And I'm always thinking, yeah, but when you believe in God, you believe that is directed by the highest intelligence ever versus us meager humans here who are clueless a lot of the time. So, so it's a totally different look. But one of the things you brought up in the book that I never even heard of, there is a transhumanist party. How long has that been around?
I don't know when it was founded exactly, but they've run in the last few elections. I know since at least 2016 because they ran a candidate for president in 2016 named Zoltán István, who's a Hungarian-American fellow. I've actually corresponded with him a bit in the course of doing research for this book. He sent me a signed copy of his book, which is called The Transhumanist Wager. I sort of, riffed off of that for the title of my book. So I'm very grateful to him for that. He, The Transhumanist Wager is this novel that's sort of written in the style of like Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, but with, transhumanism as kind of the philosophical fulcrum of it instead of, Ayn Rand's ideas of capitalism. Although he would, sympathize with her a lot, I think. But in this book, he says kind of biology for animals, right? And that's a common thread. He ran for president as the Transhumanist Party candidate in 2016. He was on a short list, I believe, to be Gary Johnson's running mate on the Libertarian Party ticket, actually, as well. He's currently running, I believe, as a Democrat in the primary for governor of California.
Oh, that's interesting.
So we'll see if that campaign goes anywhere. His line about biology being for beasts is something you see in a lot of transhumanist literature. This real disgust for human embodiment. Christopher Hitchens had a line he used that says, like, our bodies appear to have been designed by committee. There's this real. They almost appear kind of affronted or offended that they have to share sort of a biological reality with lower animals. And that's what a lot of it comes down to, is they don't view humans as a union of body and soul. As Christians, right? If you take seriously the incarnation, you believe that Christ took on it. Christ was a human being with a human body, and that because of that sort of union of the divine and the human, our human nature, in some sense, becomes the cross we take up and carry that, leads us to our redemption and our salvation.
Right.
we're kind of saved through human nature because human nature has been redeemed through Christ.
Exactly.
But for a transhumanist perspective, what a human is really is kind of a free-floating, disembodied will. And your biology doesn't have any claims that it can make upon that will. And the older idea, but the Christian idea that you could trace all the way back through the Hebrew scriptures and Thomas Aquinas, but also, a kind of pagan or classical idea that you could see in Aristotle, for example, would be that, no, like a natural law perspective, that no, as a human, you're a particular type of being and you can infer certain things about how you ought to pursue the good life from the kind of being that you are. For a transhumanist, it's just like, well, if my biology isn't cooperating with my will or my desires, then my biology goes on the chopping block. And that kind of explains everything, I go through in my first several chapters from, birth control, which is a total inversion of how medicine is supposed to work. Instead of taking something that's broken and fixing it, like setting a broken arm, because we know what a healthy, flourishing human being looks like, and medicine is supposed to intervene to restore sick or broken humans to that standard of wholeness and health. Instead of doing that, it takes a healthy, well-functioning, monthly cycle for a woman and breaks it and disrupts it in accordance with her will and her desires. Same thing with abortion. A woman is gestating a child normally, and her body's doing what it's supposed to do for a healthy, female human body. And again, medicine is supposed to intervene and disrupt that process in accordance with the woman's will or desires. Same thing with transgenderism. There's a crazy line in one of the from a transgender writer that I quote in the book named Andrea Long-Chu, who basically says that, if puberty blockers for young children that prevent them from going through puberty that's natural to their, sex, if those are too extreme for children, then we should consider, puberty itself too extreme too. So
I underlined that.
Chu's argument is we got a balance between those two, which is so strange. Like,
it is
saying that children have to consent to their own puberty that's natural to them is like saying you have to consent to your baby teeth falling out or to your stomach digesting food. It's a statement that only makes sense if you have this transhumanist mindset, which regards humans as essentially kind of free-floating, disembodied wills. And I think many people who wouldn't describe themselves as transhumanists in a million years have internalized that as kind of a presupposition in our society. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to try and wake people up to that.
And I think that first part is amazing, because I think you're right. I think, the way we think of transhumanism is kind of merging with AI or a cyborg or, putting a chip in our head or something. And because we don't understand the underlying reasons that this exists. And so, when you make the comment that, oral contraceptives are the first transhumanist technology, and then you also go on to talk about IVF and surrogacy, which are becoming more and more rampant in our society. And you talk about those also advancing the cause of transhumanism. And now we're talking about artificial wombs and ectogenesis. It's like, if you don't understand the underlying cause, these things continue to proliferate because you believe you're going after a good, correct?
Yeah. And one of the points that I make in the book that I think, attentive listeners may have picked up on by now is that a lot of these are kind of specifically women's issues. Reproductive technologies play a huge role in this, whether it's IVF or contraception or abortion or artificial wombs. And that's because the sort of ideal of the liberated kind of transhuman individual that's totally free and autonomous and self-determining, that ideal doesn't exist anywhere. That's not how human beings are. We're, rational, dependent, embodied animals, right?
Right.
But men are closer to that ideal than women are just by nature. Men don't carry around those relationships of dependence in their biology the same way that women do. Men don't carry children, don't give birth, don't nurse, all of these things. So if you're going to set up that ideal of the totally self-determining autonomous will as the goal and try to pursue that, you're going to have to do a lot more violence to women's biology than to men's biology in order to get there. Which,
and do you think
there's a number of there's a number of kind of quotes that I include in the book and that I found elsewhere that back that up. Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously argues in one of her opinions in the Supreme Court that, unless women have access to contraception and abortion, they can't participate as full members of society. The implication being that your biology as a woman makes you subhuman in some sense, at least in the context of a modern, democratic capitalist society.
Right.
And that explains everything from, women being offered money by their employers to fly out of state and abort their children if they live in states with abortion bans. It explains women being offered incentives to freeze their eggs so they can stay in the workforce longer. In many ways, female biology is the most inconvenient truth for the transhumanist movement, and that's why I think women are bearing the brunt of it right now.
Yeah, and it seems like even in the transgender movement, which is certainly a part of this whole part of the book on body, that seems to be true. Statistically, if I'm reading them correctly, it appears that more young girls want to transition than young boys. Have you seen those stats?
Yes, I have. Yeah, Abigail Schreier writes about this, and I put that in my book. There's this weird social contagion that appears to especially be affecting young girls, and I quote a number of authors in the book. One's a guy named Jonathan Van Maren who writes for the European Conservative and is very sharp, but kind of putting together a bunch of this stuff. The theory I end up going with in the book that I think is correct is that you have sort of two forms of transhumanism intersecting with young girls right now. So one of them is kind of the biotech side, and the other one is what I tackle in the next section of the book, which is the sort of alienation from reality around us, from the external world, not just from our own bodies, but from the world surrounding us, because of the increasing prevalence of things like virtual and augmented reality and artificial intelligence.
Right, right.
Which these are technologies that really discarnate us, or the opposite of incarnate. It takes you away from your embodied self. It puts you in this place where you're kind of everywhere and nowhere. You're interacting on these, apps or social networks or forums or whatever it is. You're interacting as a disembodied being. Technologies really discarnate people, like I was saying, in this way that takes you away from your body, and it encourages people to associate their identity, to view their own bodies as kind of secondary to their identity or as irrelevant to their identity.
So unhealthy.
One aspect of this that I think is hard on young girls, especially, is pornography, where you have the sexual act is kind of the most embodied thing that we as humans do, and it sort of takes the body out of that equation and kind of rewires your brain to experience this in a virtual, disembodied way that, in many ways is disconnected from how one would want to experience it in an embodied way. It's often very kind of violent and degrading, and often very sort of idealized at the same time in ways that wouldn't necessarily translate to reality. And many young women are very afraid of this. They're encountering boys who are more likely to want to try to be violent or rough with them in ways that they might not want or enjoy. Exactly. So that's one side of it, is just the relations between the sexes have been so poisoned by pornography and by this kind of discarnated form of sexuality. Yeah. And then at the same time, young women have an escape hatch they didn't have before. So a lot of young women, that I've talked to in my life have gone through a period around puberty where they've been very uncomfortable in their bodies. Sure. Suddenly they're being looked at in ways they're not used to. This is a time when many young girls struggle with eating disorders. I know young women who chose to kind of dress androgynously for a while because they weren't comfortable with being looked at and were, felt themselves unready to shoulder the burden of being a woman. But they grow out of that. Whereas now there's there's this temptation held out, which is if you are scared of being a woman, you actually don't have to be. We can make all of that go away for you.
Yep.
And many women are taking that escape hatch, unfortunately.
Do you think trans surgery, that's being done today, is that what, like plastic surgery? And again, I think women are more susceptible to this. But as culture has moved on, I think men are getting more susceptible to it. But plastic surgery was always like, I don't like this about my body. I don't like that. And I'm not talking about the ones where there's something wrong, that needs to be fixed. It's just that I don't like these things. I don't like the way I look. I don't, do you think that whole movement in plastic surgery was a step kind of towards this trans surgery? Because it's not just I don't like that I have a fat belly. It's I don't like that I have breasts and I want to be a man. I mean, is this a movement in the same direction, or are we talking two totally different things?
No, I think it's a pretty natural step from the one to the other. And I think even if you just look at plastic surgery, you can see some really troubling trends. There have been articles written about the rise of the Instagram face, where people are using Instagram filters on themselves, basically, and like how those look. So they go in and have the plastic surgeries done on their faces so they look more like how they look with that Instagram filter on.
Wow.
Which is kind of a terrifying example of, sort of the idealized version of virtual reality looping back around and causing us to do violence to ourselves in the real world in order to conform ourselves to it.
Wow.
But yeah, when it comes to cosmetic surgeries, I tend to, if I'm asked for advice or something, I tend to discourage people from getting things done if it's just something you don't like.
Right.
I've had kind of a small cosmetic procedure before to fix like a spider vein on my face, because that's something that went wrong with my body and I wanted to have it fixed, and I don't have a problem with that.
Right.
But what you're really starting to see, there's this very strange thing going on that almost seems like a sort of dystopian, Hunger Games type phenomenon where we have this kind of elite ruling class that in many cases barely looks human anymore, who've had so much work done, kind of at the upper echelons of wealth and power, at least the ones that are in the public spotlight, where you look at pictures of them from when they were young versus today, and their cheeks look weird, their eyes look weird. You could see it a lot with President Biden even a few years ago, where he'd had so much work done that he was almost unrecognizable from how he looked in the 1980s or 90s.
Yeah,
so
you do notice
weird,
that a lot.
Foothold transhumanism has among our elite.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, and I know we'll get more into this a little bit more in the second half of the show, but that has always been the elites, in a sense, that we talk about, people in charge. That was the ruling class that brought about the first eugenics movement. When you look at the names, I couldn't believe it when I first studied this stuff. The names that were involved, Rockefellers, Ford, Kellogg, all these people, we tend to always point to Margaret Sanger, but there were lots of people involved in this eugenics movement, because it was trying to make people better than what they naturally were, in a sense. And
Julian Huxley, Julian Huxley, who coined the term transhumanism in its modern sense in, I think, 1957. He also served as the president or head of the British Eugenics Society, and advocated for people to be involuntarily sterilized if they were unemployed for too long.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. So it's like we're seeing it come around again, and we've only got like a minute and a half left in the first half of the show. It's going by so fast, but it really does. And I want to get more into this the second half of the show, but it starts kind of by making people feel like I'm in control. I'm in control of my will, etc. But at some point, the culture of society or a governing class will start to take over. And so it's like a fake idea of human freedom, right? I mean, it's like, yeah.
No,
And
I think a lot of people have this idea that, like, oh, well, these transhumanist technologies could be used for evil in a totalitarian state like communist China or something. But here in the good old US of A, we believe in freedom and consent and bodily autonomy. So these technologies will just be used for individual empowerment and to increase human freedom and autonomy. And it's like, well, if you don't think that the state, the market, the culture, the media, big businesses, if you think these, powerful institutions and entities in our society aren't going to be able to apply indirect pressures to you to remake yourself and kind of do violence to your own body and your own mind in order to serve their interests and their bottom line, then you're being dangerously naive.
Yeah. And boy, I want to talk a little bit more about that in the second half of the show. And we are at break time. So today our guest is Grayson Quay. He's a consultant and author, formerly a news and opinion editor at the Daily Caller and Weekend Edition of the Week, editor of At the Week. He's also a graduate of Grove City College, Georgetown University, prolific writer. But we're talking about his book, The Transhumanist Temptation. So much stuff in here for us to think about. So come back on the other side of the break as we pick up this fascinating conversation. You're listening to The Virtuous Life, and I'm your host, Pat Oedy-Murray.
Jesus commanded his disciples to go forth and preach the gospel to all nations. This they did in word and in deed. More recently, the Second Vatican Council reaffirmed every Catholic's role in this Great Commission. In answer to this call, St. Paul Street Evangelization has developed a unique, non-confrontational approach to this mandate, loosely modeled after the modern pro-life movement. We aren't like many other evangelists that are pushy and in your face. We don't stand and yell on street corners or force anyone to listen to us if they don't want to. Instead, St. Paul Street Evangelization is committed to presenting a positive, passionately Catholic, and non-confrontational presence to a world hungry for the truth. For more information on how you can help, go to www.streetevangelization.com.
Thinking about separation or divorce? Retrouvaille is a Christian peer ministry designed to help troubled couples regain the health of their marriage. It helps spouses reawaken the love, trust, and commitment that originally brought them together. Retrouvaille has helped tens of thousands of couples around the world. To learn more about Retrouvaille or to register for a weekend near you, call 1-800-470-2230 or visit us on the web at www.helpourmarriage.com.
Hello and welcome back to The Virtuous Life. I'm your host, Pat Oedy-Murray, and today we're talking about a topic that I just think is so important for us to understand, because sometimes I feel like we have so many things in our lives that we're just dealing with what's right in front of us. Sometimes I feel like, I'm a little puppy and seeing a squirrel and then I run over there, and we just look at the surface level of things. We don't dig deep and see what the guiding force is. And if we don't know that, we can be easily led down the wrong path and taken advantage of. And so today we're talking about a book, The Transhumanist Temptation. I love he uses the word temptation. And we're interviewing the author, Grayson Quay. He's a consultant and author, obviously, formerly a news and opinion editor at the Daily Caller and a weekend editor at The Week. He's a graduate of Grove City College, Georgetown University. He's written for First Things, Federalist, Spectator, lots of different publications. And this book is an eye-opener. And it puts lots of things in connection. So welcome back, Grayson. It's so good to have you on the show.
Glad to be here.
I want to jump back just a little bit because we were talking about the body, because you divide these up into 5 parts. But I want to, because something as I'm reading seems counterintuitive to me, so I want you to explain the connection, because I think at first blush it's hard to see. Because there is a life extension movement in the transhumanist field, right? When they're looking at the life extension movement, but then they also support assisted suicide, or what we call medically assistance in death in Canada. That seems counterintuitive. Explain that connection for us.
Yeah, it does seem kind of paradoxical or counterintuitive, but I think that if you look at it closely, the two things line up perfectly. So on one hand, you do have the movement for kind of radical life extension. Kind of the most extreme figure in that would be this Silicon Valley guy, Brian Johnson, who, he calls it the Don't Die movement, where he just sort of obsessively tracks all of his body's metrics. He gets blood transfusions from his 18-year-old son to try and keep himself youthful. He gets all kinds of procedures done. It's very bizarre. He already looks sort of inhuman, like he looks a lot like Data the android from Star Trek, if anyone's seen that. So that's sort of the radical life extension side, which is, makes sense from a transhumanist perspective. We want to go beyond human limitations, and that includes the limitation of our lifespan, 70, as the scripture says. But on one hand, there's not anything inherently transhumanist about just wanting to extend the human lifespan. We've always had sort of a hard cap in the 80s or 90s. That's kind of always how long the oldest people live. Right. But we've had the average life expectancy raised enormously since, say, 1800, where it was around in like the 40s. But that's mostly because we've managed to decrease infant mortality greatly. So you had a lot of deaths at 0 and 1 years old that were dragging the average down. Kind of raising that cap from, the 80s and 90s into maybe the, 110s and 120s is kind of more of a transhumanist goal. But even then, I don't necessarily think there's a problem with it if you take sort of a teleological view of medicine, which is to fix what's broken and fix what's breaking down.
Right.
You could use kind of prosthetic organs and things like that to replace those that are wearing out. Lots of people have knee replacements, for example. I don't think that these are transhumanist technologies. Right. And this is kind of a trap that transhumanists will set, where they'll say, like, oh, so you're just against technology in general. Like, you just think that people should die of cancer because treating it with technology is bad, or you just think that, I shouldn't have my pacemaker or my knee replacement or something like that. Right. And the response to that is not to throw up your hands and say, well, okay, let's just, have designer babies and upload ourselves to the cloud and live forever. The response to that is, well, no, if you are going to have a prosthesis in that way, it should try to replicate the function of the organ it's replacing. So kind of my shorthand for this is, a pirate can have a peg leg. He shouldn't replace his lost leg with a blunderbuss. Yeah. And I think that's a pretty useful thing. That it's not it wouldn't be transhumanism to give yourself, an artificial pacemaker that replaces the function of the pacemaker cells in your heart. It would be a transhumanist thing to do, to remove a perfectly healthy human heart and try to replace it with one that pumps blood better or something like that, like an artificial one. Right. So there's a lot that we could do within the realm of kind of non-transhumanist teleological medicine that serves authentic human flourishing that I think could extend our lifespan by a ways. Maybe we'll all end up living to 120 like Moses, with a eye undimmed and vigor unabated, as Exodus says. But yeah, what these people often propose is using genetic engineering and things like that, which would really transform humans into a new species. Kind of at the most radical end, you have people who say that if you can live to, I think, 2040, you can expect to live 1,000 years, because you can just kind of go back in and have yourself rejuvenated and made useful again every 50 years or so. So, hang on, right? We're almost there, I guess.
Well, see, I always think of the Green Mile, the Green Mile, the guy at the end, Tom Hanks at the end saying, I didn't want to live that long. All my friends are gone, and I'm thinking too, there is a reason that we do shed these mortal bodies and wait for the resurrection of them, but can you tie that then? Can you tie that to euthanasia then?
Yeah. So on one hand, just if you go the full transhumanist route with life extension and abolish death altogether, then the only way you can die if you decide you want to is through, voluntary assisted suicide.
Okay.
And
I didn't.
It also, assisted suicide, medical aid in dying, whatever you want to call it, also dovetails with this transhumanist idea of what medicine is for, which we talked about earlier with abortion and birth control and things like that, which is not to restore a body to health and flourishing, but to cater to the patient's desires. Right. So, under the old view, kind of a Hippocratic view, if you went to a doctor and said, "I'd like you to kill me," that would be the ultimate betrayal of the medical profession's purpose. Their job is not to kill you; it's to make you well and to make you whole. Mm-hmm. But in this case, from the transhumanist perspective, under that mindset, your desire trumps everything else. And then also there's the angle that we were talking about right before the break, where people might not necessarily be coerced, but they can be nudged. Yeah. The world got this horrific shock when the horrors of Nazi Germany came to light, where people life unfit to live was the term they used in German, where people were being involuntarily euthanized for reasons of genetic defects or mental health defects or chronic diseases and things like that. We don't do that, but we do use medical aid in dying, and it's already happening, to nudge people considered undesirable toward ending their own lives. It's not going to be done involuntarily in the societies we have today because there's so much emphasis on consent and individual autonomy, which are, big transhumanist values. So in many ways, what we have is a purer version of transhumanism than even the early eugenics movement that was coercive had.
Yeah.
But these people can be indirectly coerced. There are people in Canada, there are cases of traumatized war veterans who've been told, you should just seek medical aid in dying, because you're probably going to kill yourself eventually, and it's better than shooting yourself or slashing your wrist.
Yeah.
And this says something really troubling about society, which is that the more you give people the option to remake themselves in order to fit social systems, the more you give those social systems permission to become increasingly inhuman.
Yes.
So, for most of history, if your country sent boys off to war and they came back traumatized, it was the responsibility of that country, or at least of communities within that country, to help those people pull through and build, reintegrate to civilian life and build productive lives in peacetime. Now you can send people off to war, shatter them in all these horrible ways, and then just sort of shuffle them off stage.
Yep.
And people have been offered, made in cases where they have chronic diseases that are very costly and inconvenient to treat, and that are considered a drain on the healthcare system. They're not forced to do this, but they're sort of nudged toward it. Doctors will say, "Oh, well, this is going to be really expensive. Maybe you should consider this other option."
Yeah. And, when we were talking about that kind of nudging in the first half of the show, one of the things that jumped out at me was when you were talking in the second part of your book on reality, which obviously deals with AI and augmented reality. And the augmented reality is how, we interact with the world using technology. And I'm thinking about like those QR codes that drive me nuts because I don't have a smartphone. And so I always look at those like, well, that doesn't do me any good. I kind of, people always say, well, just get a smartphone. No, I'm not going to get a smartphone. I refuse to participate. But I mean, you start to get closed out of things because you don't have a smartphone that can do those things. And that's when people say, well, nobody can force you to do anything. That's very true. Nobody's forcing me to get a smartphone, but they know how to try to nudge you into it, because, well, now you can't participate in this and now you can't, so I think this whole idea that when we're blind to that, when we don't realize how we're being manipulated into these things, we just go with the flow because that's what we need to continue. So I want to move ahead because you've got so much in here, but I do want to move ahead to part 3. Which is on politics and transhumanism. So in the book, you make this link, well, you don't, other number of authors, and you write about it, between liberalism, that there's this link between liberalism to transhumanism. Can you kind of explain that and then kind of tell us this political issue in transhumanism?
Yeah, so at sort of the kind of dawn of the modern age, in the 17th and 18th centuries, you had this, you had liberalism emerging as this new way of approaching political thought. And there were multiple strands of it, and some were better or worse than others. And there's a whole debate over which, thinker, how much the thinkers aligned with one another versus how much they diverged on different things. But if you look at Patrick Deneen's argument, his view is basically that that it started out with all these problems and that any redeeming factors it had have sort of dropped off in the intervening years. And what you're left with is this idea that humanity is going to base society not on any pursuit of virtue necessarily, but on individual desires or passions, specifically kind of the fear of death and the fear of violence or privation. And that based on that shared fear that we all have in common, we're going to construct a social contract that we enter into as individuals. That, only those relationships that are entered into consensually are valid, that you don't have any duties apart from those things that you enter into consensually. And that then we're going, and the purpose of society is basically just going to be to secure everyone's individual rights so that they can have as much autonomy as possible without stepping on anyone else. Right. There's no sense that humanity is ordered towards some higher good or that there's a natural end or telos for humanity. There's no sense of, the Aristotelian idea of eudaimonia or flourishing that we can point to. Society has to be neutral on all of those questions. All that the state is going to concern itself with is sort of making people leave each other alone so that they can pursue whatever they think the good is, while the state remains neutral on those questions. So, if you want to get married and have children and try to raise them to be virtuous people, that's great. If you want to enter into a 7-person polycule and, live a kind of crazy degenerate lifestyle and get 6 dogs and go to raves every weekend. Like, that's great too. These are all just individual choices, and it would be wrong for society to try to privilege one over the other because that would be limiting people's freedom. So that's sort of the voluntarist conception of society that Deneen talks about. And then the other side of it, is this focus on the conquest of nature, or the relief of man's estate, as Francis Bacon put it, which is that what's going to sustain this society in many ways is that kind of abandoning the pursuit of virtue or the idea of some higher good and like focusing on this one term that's used is low but solid ground for founding society is going to liberate human ingenuity and entrepreneurial activity in order to improve the standard of living by the gradual conquest of nature, which eventually, if you keep conquering nature, you're going to reach a place, C.S. Lewis talks about this in The Abolition of Man, where your conquest of nature becomes a conquest of human nature. And then at that point, the scientist is inside the experiment and the whole thing collapses. Because now what is human nature? It's the thing that's being remade by humanity itself.
And without human nature, you cannot define what is good or how humanity flourishes. And so it does appear, and I see this all over. We have these arguments about what is right or wrong, like, well, transgenderism is okay. No, it's not. And we never enter into a conversation about what is good, because that's really what is at the heart of all of this, isn't it? It is this understanding that we have some people who believe, yes, there are a set of values, virtues that are good for humanity. And then we have other people that saying, well, no, you can't. That's all very relative. You can't tell me. And so how do you politically engage this? Because there is no such thing as neutral ground, even politically. We've seen that happening over and over and over. Abortion's legal, transgender surgeries for minors. All these things have entered into the political realm. So what do we do with that?
Well, one area that I think illustrates this really well, just the extent to which people have internalized these transhumanist kind of late liberal ideas, is the debate over transgender procedures and hormones and puberty blockers and stuff, because it's been politically effective. But the argument that the right tends to make on this is that children can't give proper informed consent to this.
Consent, right.
When you're 12 years old, you don't know well enough to make this decision. So, in the same way that you can't go get a tattoo, you can't, make these radical changes to your body. And that's fine as far as it goes. But I would like to see, in my ideal world, I would like to see the argument go further and say, no, any transgender surgery at all is a violation of the true purpose of medicine. Any transgender surgery partakes of this transhumanist view of the human as the disembodied will that can, reshape its biology in accordance with those desires. But we haven't seen hardly any attempts, even at the state level, to restrict these procedures for adults. I believe one state introduced a bill to try to cut it off at age 25 or something like that, to where, you had to wait till you're 25 instead of just 18. But even that's kind of a drop in the bucket, There's not, most people in America sort of have this idea that, like, oh, well, consenting adults, right, should be able to do what they want. Just,
exactly.
Keep it away from the kids.
And it's never about the good then.
Yeah, no, it's not about the good.
Yeah.
We think we have a society that's neutral on questions of the good. And I don't talk about the American founding really in context of these in the book. I sort of just talk about these ideas were present at the beginning of liberalism, and here's where we've ended up with sort of the worst possible extreme incarnation of these ideas. But the American founding, some people say, like, oh, it was rotten from the start. And you can make the argument, I suppose, that these ideas were always going to unfold in a particular way over time. But if you read what the founders were writing, they did not believe this. They did not believe that the state had to be neutral on the question of the good. They believed... Exactly. They believed in natural law. These people all read Locke, and Locke was reading Hooker, who was reading Aquinas. So they had a robust understanding of natural law. There's a great, if you want, like, kind of just a brief sort of précis of this, Alexander Hamilton wrote an essay called Farmer Refuted, where he's basically answering the argument that, like, oh, you just believe in license, right? You just believe that everyone should be free to define what's good for himself as long as they leave their neighbors alone within reason. And, this is just moral anarchy. And Hamilton says, well, no, that's what Hobbes says. If you read what Locke says, according to Hamilton, he talks about natural law all the time. He believes that there are relationships and duties that are natural, that especially those of the family. He believes that even in the state of nature, when nobody's, his idea where nobody's kind of agreed to form society yet, even in that state, there's still natural law. You're still bound by the moral law, right, by reason's participation in God's eternal law. Right. So this is all there from the beginning. But we've really radically departed from it.
Yeah, we have. So I want to move. Keep in mind on time. We're running out, so I want to make sure I get to a couple more things.
Yeah.
You also talk about in the work section of the book capitalism and transhumanism. So, how does that what does transhumanism have to do with capitalism, other than robots taking our jobs?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, early on, when you kind of look at Adam Smith and the other early theorists of capitalism, they really are saying that human wants are kind of by nature insatiable. That as soon as we have something, we're going to want something else. And the kind of breakthrough idea behind that was like, well, let's sort of hitch our wagon to that, and there's no limit to how high we can climb. Right? That
right.
By steadily increasing human desires and then fulfilling those desires and sort of inculcating new ones, we can kind of produce infinite economic growth and make everyone wealthier and happier. And that's happened to some degree. You know, we certainly have a higher standard of living than people did 200 years ago. But at the same time, the danger is there's no limiting principle to that. You know, as I talk about with liberalism, if, you know, in the same way that liberalism seeks to endlessly expand individual autonomy, and that, you know, once that principle has transhumanist technologies available to it, there's no reason not to use them. In the same way, when you have an economic system that focuses sort of on maximizing consumer choice and economic growth, and that recognizes all kind of consensual transactions as equally valid, then you've opened the door to transhumanism and you have no limiting principle you can apply to that. So, you know, in the book, I spend a couple chapters talking about, well, is there a way that we could try to restore a political order that recognizes some higher conception of the good, that can sort of place limits on individual license in this way? And is there a way we could create an economic order that privileges an authentic idea of human flourishing, that says, no, it is better to get married and have children than to, you know, live with a series of live-in partners and have 6 dogs.
Right.
And I think that we should be able to say yes to both of those questions. And, you know, thankfully there are movements within, you know, the political and economic sphere that are trying to take steps toward both of those. I talk a lot about kind of new right economics and the work that the think tank The American Compass is doing as a great example on the economic side.
Yeah, well, we've got about 3 minutes left, so we've just been zipping here. But I do want to give you, because you say this is really...
I want to...
well, because we also want to talk about the whole God spiritual issue. I'm going to let you decide how you want to use these last 2.5 minutes now.
Yeah, sounds great. So yeah, the section 5 of the book is called God or Religion, and it really focuses on how this transhumanist mindset has affected how sort of the religious landscape in America and in the modern world today lies. And one thing I look at is a lot of overlaps between Satanism and transhumanism. They both have this emphasis on the individual will, on this absolute right to bodily autonomy, on kind of the shattering of limitations. On the other side, there's transhumanists. Max Moore is a prominent transhumanist who writes an essay in praise of Lucifer. There's really this sense that, you know, Satanists consider themselves very pro-science. You can look this all up on the Satanic Temple's website if you want to venture there. It's a scary place.
Yeah, it is.
That's one example. There's all these other strange transhumanist spiritualities where people, psychedelic use is on the rise, and people believe they're encountering these beings or entities that are real. They don't think this is all just a figment of their imagination. And I tend to agree with them, where they're seeking some kind of wisdom or guidance or something from a being on a higher plane that will kind of elevate them beyond the boundaries of human perception. There's a whole strange cult of UFOs that looks toward the same thing, that you know, these aliens will come down from the sky and will somehow elevate humanity beyond its limitations toward their cosmic destiny. It's kind of this weird, secularized form of a salvation story that if you look at Arthur C. Clarke wrote a novel called Childhood's End. where this is explicitly presented as satanic, like the aliens that come down literally look like demons, but they're portrayed in the novel as kind of the saviors of humanity, and the people who are scared of them as kind of paranoiacs and religious nuts.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
But the thing I want to leave people with is that I go into in one of the chapters these stories from Genesis of what are called the Nephilim. They pop up in Genesis 6, where it says the sons of God looked upon the daughters of men, saw that they were beautiful, and they had children with them, and these children are described as giants or Nephilim. And these, demon-human hybrid things are part of the reason that God ends up sending the flood. If you look in Genesis, and then if you look at kind of the expanded versions of the story that you get in the Book of Enoch, which is one of the kind of non-canonical apocryphal books that is cited by some of the church fathers. But I think there's some interesting parallels to today, where Enoch talks about the Nephilim giving humanity technologies and technical powers to make weapons and to make instruments and tools and other things like that, in order to increase their power over nature and over their fellow man.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, these demonic spirits are kind of breeding with humanity to raise them or evolve them to what they view as a higher state, which dovetails really well with the idea of merging with AI. Sam Altman calls it the merge from OpenAI.
Wow. I'll tell you, Grayson,
we're literally interfacing with disembodied superintelligences to increase our power and bootstrap ourselves to a higher level of evolution. And I think what all of this suggests is, there are, I think, some dark forces behind the introduction of these technologies to humanity. These forces want us to destroy ourselves, and they're giving us the tools to do it. In the past, God has used the flood or the destruction of the Tower or the confusion at Babel to set the clock back on that. We may be headed for another moment like that. I'm not so sure.
Wow.
And then the other thing I would take away from that is that this is something that we need to view as spiritual warfare, and that we need to be praying a lot about how we engage with these technologies and be prepared even to be left behind. To live in a world, like you said, the QR code thing is a minor inconvenience, but imagine the entire world is structured in such a way that it's impossible to navigate public spaces without some kind of brain implant. Are you willing to live on the margins in that way? Are you prepared for that? And I think we should be praying that we are.
Yeah, well, we are. We're out of time. Grayson, this was amazing. The book that we've been discussing today is The Transhumanist Temptation. Our guest was Grayson Quay. And so may you all have a blessed week ahead, and think a little deeper about what the Lord is asking of you. You've been listening to The Virtuous Life. I'm your host, Pat Oedy-Murray.